Welcome to this video, which is part of a series of conversations offered by members of the South Carolina Synod of the ELCA, addressing questions of faith, practice, and shared life in the church. In this particular conversation, we will be responding to questions about pastoral ministry, how pastors are formed, how they are prepared to preach and teach, and how the gospel is proclaimed in the life of the church. These questions often arise because people wonder how pastors are taught, what they are taught, and whether theological training remains rigorous, whether there is freedom to preach the true good news of Jesus Christ. They also touch on questions of the visible signs of ministry and how pastors embody their calling in public ways. As with all of the conversations in this series, we offer this one as an invitation to listen carefully, reflect thoughtfully, and deepen understanding of the faith that has been entrusted to the church and continues to be confessed and lived out today. Let's start by talking about how pastors and deacons are formed for ministry in the ELCA today, because some say that the ELCA pastors are no longer trained in theology or that ELCA seminaries teach heresy. Describe what theological formation actually looks like today in ELCA seminaries for pastors and deacons. What's involved in becoming a pastor or deacon in the ELCA?
Yeah. Well, we all have some experience in seminaries, some more than others. Those candidates who are headed toward ordination as pastors spend 3 years of full-time coursework, and that coursework is broad and I think rigorous. We teach students about the Bible, its contents, its history, but also how to read it, how to interpret it for the life of the church. We teach students about the history of the church, the theology of the church, and how that's been embodied in different ways throughout the centuries. And then we teach students the practical working of ministry and things like preaching and pastoral care. And I think it's also important to know that the Synod Candidacy Committee has regular meetings with the candidates, and they also talk about theology of the candidate and how that is growing during their formation during those seminary years.
So who's on a candidacy committee and what's involved in that?
Candidacy committees are made up of both lay and ordained folks, and the process is designed to be kind of a shepherding group for candidates throughout the process of ordination, either as a deacon or as a pastor. And there's 3 really kind of checkpoints along the way: entrance, endorsement, and approval. And at each of those levels, the bar kind of gets a little higher, maybe even exponentially at some points in the journey. But it's not just a check on learning. But that's certainly a big portion of it, to make sure that candidates for ordination to either track are grasping the theology of the church, have solid scriptural understanding, and know really kind of who they are as a person that's discerning a call into public ministry in the church. So it's a tandem process between the seminary and the candidacy committee to make sure that we are forming leaders who are healthy and balanced and well-grounded in theology, in scripture, and in practice of what it means to live into this call that we come to.
There's one more thing I want to say about this question about theology. We certainly teach our students the creedal the theologies of the church. We have a course on Lutheran confessional theology. Sometimes that can sound as though theology is a static thing, that it never finds new expressions, and that's a false impression. Part of what we want students to realize at seminary, is that each generation needs to think through what the gospel of Jesus means in our context, in our time, facing these issues. How do we live out that theology of the church? And I think what seminary does is equip and train deacons and pastors to do that, to help lead congregations into thinking, well, what does the gospel of Jesus Christ mean for this community here in this place now?
Yeah. I remember seeing a meme that floated in some pastor circles on Facebook for a while that, asked, well, what is seminary like versus what is life in the parish like? And the thing that was really funny about it, it said, well, seminary is a lot like culinary school, right? You learn all the building blocks and how it all kind of works together, what flavor profiles work together. But ministry is like being on Chopped, if you've ever seen it on Food Network, where you get this mystery basket of ingredients and you have to figure out like how to make something of it. And so seminary does a really good job of forming pastors and deacons to do work in the world where seminary is a far cry different than working in a parish. And so you have to do that good, solid work of understanding all of the theological constructs and doctrines and things like that to be able to apply them to real life for God's people out in the world. And so
And that's why pastors and deacons and the seminary care deeply about theology.
Yes.
And we spend a lot of time with it.
So you talked about the fact that the message is not static, right? So does the gospel change?
The gospel doesn't change, but I would compare it to the fact that we've got 4 gospels in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. They're telling the same story, but they're telling it in 4 different ways. Mm-hmm. I think because there are 4 different communities they're speaking to, and those communities have their own questions and needs and context. And so we've got this gospel of God's grace in Jesus Christ that is broader and deeper than we can ever understand fully. It's multifaceted. And so it's like turning a diamond and seeing how it flashes off that facet.
Right.
Well, that's our facet today. Let's explore what the gospel means for that.
There's an odd claim out there. Some question whether pastors can still preach the gospel in the ELCA. What do you think people mean when they ask that question?
I wonder what people's understanding of the gospel is. I remember when I was an intern, we had the congregation that I was serving at was asked to provide some written feedback on my preaching on a particular Sunday. And one of the questions on the form was the gospel proclaimed? Because I used one of the other lessons as a primary preaching text that day, a lot of people said no. Even though the gospel was proclaimed, it wasn't the gospel text that necessarily was the primary source for the proclamation that day. And so I wonder with you, really, like, what does that mean to people who say this or who ask that question? Because there's a difference between reading the gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John and the gospel as the good news about what God is doing in redeeming the world through the grace and love of Jesus Christ. And that exists outside also of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's one of the theological constructs that are really important to Lutherans is law and gospel, right? And law doesn't all exist solely in the Old Testament, and gospel doesn't solely exist in the New Testament. So where do we find that good news in the whole of the Bible? So I struggle with the claim that we can't proclaim the gospel because it's who we are.
Yeah, I mean, the proclamation of the gospel is at the heart of the whole church's existence, but certainly I think of the ELCA as part of that. I think that question of what's the gospel that they're talking about is really crucial, because I wonder if for some people maybe the style of preaching or the particular emphases of the preacher they grew up with, maybe that becomes synonymous with the gospel for them.
Right.
And so if they hear it expressed somewhat differently, they think, oh, it's not the gospel anymore. So I think that prior question, what's the gospel? I know that the seminary I attended a long time ago and the seminary I teach at both insisted and insist that the whole point of preaching is to proclaim that grace of God in Jesus Christ for all the world. Yes. And there are some things that sounds like. It sounds like God does things.
Yes.
God does saving, redeeming things. Mm-hmm. And God does that through Jesus. And God does it without a lot of if-yous attached to it.
Right.
That's the gospel we're talking about. I think that's what the gospel the church has always talked about. Mm-hmm. Ever since the women came back from the tomb and said, Jesus is risen.
That's right.
God is doing something new here.
Yeah.
There's another somewhat odd claim that some people make, that pastors cannot wear clerical collars anymore. Obviously, the person sitting to my left rebuts that question, but first of all, what's the purpose of a clerical collar? I mean, why do men and women in ordained pastoral ministry sometimes wear a collar? What's it supposed to signify?
We had a conversation at the seminary about students wearing collars in hospital visits and work in their congregations a number of years ago. It was a really interesting conversation, I thought. And part of what came out of that was that it's a sign to people around, not only that you are connected to the life of the church,
right,
and representing the gospel in this situation, but it's also a sign that you are available. Mm-hmm. You are offering yourself as companion, as servant. If they need someone,
right,
you are, in a sense, opening yourself up to that. And that's a really privileged and vulnerable thing to do.
Absolutely.
So part of that, wearing the collar, is to be in the world as a visible servant of the church, a servant of Christ.
Yeah. And beyond that, I'll often think back to one of the quotes that I heard a lot throughout my childhood from Fred Rogers. When things are hard or difficult or you're scared, look for the helpers. Mm-hmm. Well, how do you know what the helpers look like? And, as children, we're taught that, police officers and firefighters and EMTs, people in maybe a military uniform, those are folks that we were taught as children, that those are the helpers. The church has a version of that too, mm-hmm. and sometimes it looks like a collar. Mm-hmm. It is that outward visible sign that says, "Hey, I'm here to walk beside you through whatever life is throwing at you," and I find it to be a helpful reminder that there are people out in the world whose vocation it is to remind people that God has not abandoned them. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important visible symbol of pastoral ministry.
I think it's also true that there are contexts in our culture mm-hmm. where wearing a collar can actually become an impediment. Mm-hmm. And it saddens me that it is that way. Yes. But some people have been hurt by the church. Mm-hmm. Scandals from within the church have perhaps spoiled the reputation.
Right.
And the doors that clerical collars maybe at one time opened, in some contexts, the collar can close that door now. Mm-hmm. And so that depends on discernment mm-hmm. On the part of the leader. Mm-hmm. Is this a context where wearing the collar is a faithful and helpful thing to do?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Or is it in fact going to get in the way of the ministry? Mm-hmm. I know that's never legislated. It's not like the ELCA right. says you cannot wear a collar if you live in this state. Right. But there are pastors mm-hmm. who decide this is not helpful in our context.
Right.
And so they may not wear a collar, but that's their choice mm-hmm. and their discernment for their own ministry.
Yep.
Thank you. We've been talking about pastoral ministry, the training of pastors and preaching and signs. What gives you hope about pastoral ministry today in the ELCA?
One of the joys that I've had as a parish pastor has been supervising field education students from the seminary and even one intern in the process of formation, and getting to see how theological education continues to shift and evolve to be able to address the concerns the world that we live in, and it always remains contextual, and I find that to be really helpful, and it gives me hope as I get to walk alongside some students. Oftentimes I had one who had a grandchild my age, right, which was really fun, right? But to be able to walk beside them through their formation process, and to kind of relearn alongside of them. One of my field ed students also we employed at the church full time, and this was during COVID and everything was online, and so it was great. Some days I'd get to sit in on classes with him on Zoom or whatever the platform was that they were using, and kind of get some continuing education along the way and remember some of the things that I might have forgotten throughout ministry. But I think that we are still forming leaders that are equipped and capable to walk alongside God's people in a rapidly changing world. And that is so important because the world is a crazy place, right? and I think that our seminaries are doing an excellent job to do their best to equip leaders for the sake of the world, to go out and proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, and to remind people, hey, God's not done with us, and still walks alongside us, and that's important.
Thank you. As we end this conversation, our hope is that what you have heard here helps clarify some questions that you may have heard and encourages continued conversation in your congregations, among leaders, and across our shared life together. We invite you to carry on with these reflections, holding fast to what unites us in Christ, and trusting that God continues to guide the church with faithfulness and grace, even in times of change.